let's go through chapter 5 here. Camera all fixed up. We'll see how we're doing. Okay, we're going to go through chapter 5, the popular radio and origins of broadcasting. We'll try to do that today quickly here. And hopefully the next one we get to do will be in class. So let's cross our fingers that we get to do that. We're going to go back on Tuesday for most of you. So one of the main things about radio, and again, one of the reasons people really listen a lot is, again, sort of the individualized thing. So when they call it intimate and authentic connections, the idea is that it's, sort of personal in terms of radio. The other thing that really happened recently was podcasting breakthrough. So a third of Americans really tuned into those, and 1 out of 6 Americans listen to at least one per week. And today there's more than 400,000 podcast titles available. 1,000 is added every week. And again, 45% of all podcasts address society, culture. Some of them are true crime, is one of them that's kind of popular. And again, radio creating podcasts out of live broadcasting too. They're doing that right now. I haven't really gotten into it that much. A little bit I've watched or listened to some. But again, it depends on, where you're listening to and how you're listening to. Because a lot of people still would listen to car or again at home, however they want to do it. And again, to me, it's more, I probably do more YouTube things than I would podcasts. So the early technology and the development of the radio that really started in the 1840s with telegraph, and that was really the precursor of radio technology. It was invented in the 40s, developed by American inventor Samuel Morse. And again, Morse code was a series of dots and dashes that stood for letters in the alphabet. And news and messages were transmitted by telegraph operators, interrupting electrical current along a wire cable. And one of the important things that really relates to journalism on this is, particularly in the Civil War, the inverted pyramid came about in terms of how we do writing, sort of derived from the Morse code and the transmission of telegraph, because the idea was you'd send the most important information first, and then the less important information would be second or third. And that's because in case anything happened to the wire or whatever, they got the most important information across the line. So that it's interesting that did have an effect on future journalism. So it was first set up between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, and then eventually ran coast to coast by 1861. So again, it was very important in terms of the telegraph and in terms of development of the country too. I mean, it was very important in that sense. So how did we actually get into discovering radio waves? And again, Maxwell and Hertz, if you're familiar with any of the terminology related to radio, Hertz is one that's a very familiar term. So James Maxwell, he investigated electromagnetic waves in 1860s, and again, invisible electronic impulses similar to visible light, and then radio waves where electricity, magnetism, light, and heat radiate in the space in the electromagnetic spectrum at the speed of light. So it was believed that a portion of these waves could be harnessed to transmit signals, and that was really how we got a wireless situation eventually down the road. So Heinrich Hertz provided and improved Maxwell's theories in the 1880s and helped advance the development of wireless communication, which became extremely important in terms of our technology development. So here's a picture of the electromagnetic spectrum for those who have taken physics. I'm sure you'd be familiar with this. So visible light is just a small portion of the spectrum. And again, if you go to the low entry, low wavelength, low frequency, you have AM radio, shipping and aircraft bands, shortwave radio, TV and FM radio, then microwaves, infrared, red light, and then we go into the higher energy or high frequency, you have ultraviolet light, X-rays, gamma rays, all those things. So it's interesting how visible is just a small portion of the spectrum. That was one reason I loved physics so much, because it was very intriguing to me about how that worked. So Marconi and the inventors of the wireless telegraphy were, Marconi was the first one with wireless telegraphy in terms of forms of voiceless point-to-point communication. He got a patent in England in 1896, and then Alexander Popov made parallel discoveries in Russia. And one of the most famous that's underrated is Nikola Tesla. If anybody remembers watching him on some of the shows that they have about science and ancient aliens, all that, he's a really interesting character in terms of what impact he had in terms of discoveries. And he invented a wireless system in 1892, and Marconi ended up using much of Tesla's work in that process. And finally, he was deemed the inventor of radio in 1943. So he was an important figure in terms of the wireless system. Once we got into telephone, in terms of the wireless telephone process that gave us today's where we're at in terms of cell phones, DeForest and Fessenden were two that actually had a big impact in terms of this. Lee DeForest wrote his first PhD thesis on wireless technology in 1899, which seems crazy, but that's back when he was working on it. And again, the wireless voice and music transmission was considered wireless telephony. And then the biggest breakthrough is development of the Audion, which I believe is shows that in the book too. There's either pictures of it or background on it. Reginald Fessenden was the first voice broadcast. He worked for the U.S. Navy and General Electric to improve wireless signals. And then the broadcasting was the transmission of radio waves to a broad public audience. And narrowcasting was considered person-to-person communication, such as the telegraph and the telephone itself. So when we talk about broadcasting corporations, that's the idea on it. It's to a broad audience as opposed to telephone and telegraph. So how do they regulate it? That was one of the big things. And radio waves is sort of a natural resource. And the Radio Act of 1912 was very, very important. It addressed the problem of amateur radio operators increasingly cramming the airwaves, so it required licensing. They also adopted the SOS distress signal. And finally, in World War I, the Navy took control of radio. And then the corporate heads of government and leaders, they conspired to make sure the radio served American interests first. So that was another issue that really came about with it. So the Radio Act of 1912 was an important one too. Remember that one for a possible test question. The formation of RCA was also critical. That was the Radio Corporation of America, RCA, which still stands today. Acquired American Marconi and radio patents of other U.S. companies, and then the leading founder, GE, broke off negotiations to sell radio technologies to European companies. So finally, RCA became a monopoly, and it really did give the United States almost total control over broadcasting. So, and today, if you still think about it, we still are the major media players anyway in that sense too, because all these companies still exist in some form, as opposed to what they were early. So the evolution of radio, Frank Conrad was the Westinghouse established first commercial radio broadcast station, KDKA, in 1920 in Pittsburgh. That's one of the few, normally anything west of the Mississippi has a K in front of it, and anything east of the Mississippi has a W. But that was one of the few stations that actually still has a K on it and still in existence. Charles Doc Harold, he began a station in 1909 that later became KCBS. And finally, the U.S. Commerce Department licensed 5 radio stations for operation in 1921. So there was really sort of a battle once it got started in terms of who was going to wrest control from who. And it always goes down to the money is what it really boils down to. So RCA had a partnership, and they had a network that was cost-saving operation, so that linked a group of the broadcasting stations that shared programming, produced at a central location. One of the partnerships in it, AT&T, broke the agreement in 1922 to attempt to try to monopolize radio themselves, and they began making and selling its own radio receivers. They started WEAF in New York, the first station to sell advertising, which was critical, and created the first radio network, which GE, Westinghouse, and RCA all created their own radio group in response to this. So that's how we ended up with some of the partnerships and some of the companies that have evolved and again that are still in existence today. So David Sarnoff was the RCA's first general manager, and basically he created NBC, which was shared by RCA, GE, and Westinghouse. And the original telephone group became the NBC Red Network, and the radio group became known as NBC Blue. So that was the other thing in terms of how NBC created, and we know that's still in existence, and still, you know, the originations of the company go all the way back to this. The other thing that NBC did is they paid NBC to carry its programs. The affiliates had to pay them. NBC sold national advertising, and they emphasized on national programming. And Sarnoff also cut a deal with GM to manufacture car radios. And I still think that's one of the most important advancements in radio at that time, because once you had radios in cars, it kind of changed society too. If you think about what people did in cars and driving cars in the 20s and 30s, that, you know, the radio was almost integral to the car itself. And today we can't live without having our Apple Music or some form of radio or CD or whatever in cars. So it really was a huge deal at that point. And they merged the RCA with the Victor Talking Machine Company too. So that was another thing that Sarnoff was famous for. So government scrutiny sort of ended the RCA NBC monopoly, and this was during the time frame in the 20s of sort of the robber barons and monopolies and Standard Oil and all that they were trying to break up monopolies. So the Federal Trade Commission charged RCA with violations of antitrust laws as early as 23, and then RCA bought out GE and Westinghouse's shares in RCA's manufacturing business, and finally the government accepted RCA's breakup proposal before a trial came about. So again, the idea was to avoid monopolies and not having competition. So CBS, the first attempt to create CBS failed, but William S. Paley tried to challenge NBC, and he bought a controlling share in the company and launched new concepts and strategies, and hired a PR guru, Edward Bernays, who's actually famous. If anybody does any type of public relations or human resource type of thing, you'll see how he was one of the first ones in terms of the creating public relations for networks. And it was the first time they really had ever done that. So he's very famous for that. That's another one to sort of know for the test. They also created the option time, which CBS paid affiliate stations $50 an hour for an option on a portion of their time. And they would try to lure the affiliate stations because of that. And they also rated NBC for top talent. So once they got CBS rolling, and it became the top network in 1949. So the other thing that really sort of helped bring order to stop the chaos of radio was the Radio Act of 1927. It stated the station could only license their channels as long as they operated to serve the public interest, convenience, or necessity. And the Federal Radio Commission, FRC, began to oversee licenses and negotiate channel problems. Also in the 30s, the Communications Act of 1934 established the Federal Communications Commission to regulate broadcasting and narrowcasting. And the FCC, which we're very familiar with now, Federal Communications Commission jurisdiction covered radio, TV, telegraph, later television, cable, and internet. So know these. These are all important that you should actually know for any type of objective testing too. So the activists, FCC also went after networks in 1941. They outlawed the practice of option time. They demanded that RCA sell one of its two NBC networks, and from that came about the NBC Blue was sold and became ABC, the American Broadcasting Company, which still exists today also. So it's interesting to see how all these separations and how they divided ended up with the media corporations that we have today. So the golden age of radio was the early radio programming. We only had a handful of stations. There was live music, 15-minute evening programs, variety shows, quiz shows, dramatic shows. Most of them had a single sponsor. The term soap opera came from the soap companies actually sponsoring radio programs. So Procter & Gamble was very big at that. They would have one of their Dove soap or somebody else, something like that would be the sponsor for one particular radio program. And radio program also sort of did mirror culture at the time in the 30s. Again, the most popular comedy was in the 1930s was Amos and Andy, which was very stereotyped. It had black tape characters as shiftless and stupid. It created the idea of a serial show. It moved to TV and was the first show with an entirely black cast. But finally, it was canceled in 1953 amid the strengthening of the civil rights movement. But that was sort of the game in the 30s, though, in terms of some of the characters, and it really wasn't the best thing in the world, that's for sure. So the other one, the authority radio, came about, and this we think about this is how it actually impacted society. One of the famous broadcasts was 1938 by Orson Welles on Halloween, that he did The War of the Worlds, and which was a book that actually, he translated into actually a play on air, and it created a panic in New York and New Jersey. And it prompted the FCC to call for stricter warnings before and during programs because it did imitate the style of radio news. The one I think about in terms of movies is Cloverfield. If anybody's familiar with the Cloverfield, that's very similar. Imagine if Cloverfield had been sort of a fake thing rather than a real reality type of show that it is. So I really did like that movie too. That was pretty interesting. I always think of War of Worlds when I think of Cloverfield too. So the other thing that really helped radio become portable was transistors, and they were small electrical devices that receive and amplify radio signals. So they're more durable, less expensive than the vacuum tubes that were used in the big old radios in the 30s. Less power, produce less heat. You can have a creation of a small pocket radio. They made radio portable. I can remember my first little pocket radio I got when I was in probably, I don't know, 5th grade, 4th grade, that I used to listen to basketball games on, and I thought I was the bomb because I had it. The other thing that happened was the FM revolution and Edwin Armstrong. So FM, it actually means in terms of definition, frequency modulation radio. It accentuated the pitch or distance between the radio waves, and it was discovered by Edwin Armstrong in the 20s and 30s. So it had greater fidelity and clarity than the amplitude modulation AM radio. And it lost RCA support to TV. And finally, the FCC opened up the spectrum space for FM in the 60s. And by the 80s, it surpassed AM radio because it had better quality. And, you know, when I was growing up, once we got stereo, which in the sort of the late 60s, and FM had much better sound when you were listening to the radio. So it was really great if you had a car that had, AM, FM in it. And I thought it was the best invention ever at the time when I was young, when I was a teen. So AM, again, amplitude modulation radio, stress volume, or height of radio waves. So again, there's the difference in terms of the two. Try to remember these two. This is a possible test question too. So the rise of the format, the top 40 radio, again, this was developed in 1949 by Todd Stortz. They managed and controlled programming. So the idea was you'd have a format of what they could play and couldn't play, and the rotation were the top songs playing many times during the given day. And I think we all know what that's like even today when you listen to your car in the morning and then in the afternoon and you're driving and you hear the same song going over and over again. And I think we get a little tired of that. But again, this is how formatting came about. And the top 40 were the 40 most popular hits in a given week as measured by their sales. And again, we still have that's a similar type system. So we do know, obviously, with Apple downloads, we know what's the most popular songs, and you can push on the popular music if you want to. And it also made the creation of program log and day parts too. So some people, that's one reason FM became so popular, is because they didn't just have the play logs, and they played album rock, and they would play songs that were longer than 4 and 5 minutes. And FM, you know, was sort of seen as sort of a cooler type thing when it came about. So again, expansion of FM, how they resisted the top 40 was the mid 60s created room for experimentation. So we had progressive rock, alternative conventional formats. In Oxford, we had 97X, which was the coolest station ever. I listened to for many years because they didn't have direct playlists. They more or less would play anything that came about, became not pop rock, but more alternative. So the experimental stations played hard edge political folk music too. And of course, this is in the sort of late 60s. And then album-oriented rock, AOR, tamed the variation of progressive rock, and generally some of the FM would also play classic rock. I think WEBN in Cincinnati would be one of the first ones that I always listened to that played a lot of rock back then. So again, the sounds of commercial radio today are unlike radio's first audiences. Radio has become a secondary or background medium. The drive time between 6 and 9 and between 4 and 7 are really the time, peak time, rather than prime time at night. And the stations become more specialized too. So I don't use radio as much. I'm always listening to Apple Music usually, and I think that's the other niche part that's changed. So the format specialization, I always find this interesting. I'm sad I'm not in class because we have the variety of formats. We have news, talk, information. So radio stations that are dominated by news, talk, and information formats. Usually they're AM, and they appeal to adults over age 35. Now the music formats would be like adult contemporary, which is middle of the road, over 40 type of thing, news, talk, oldies, soft rock, where they have the disc jockeys talking back and forth, all that kind of stuff. Contemporary hit radio, CHR, appeals to teens and young adults. It covers everything from rap to punk rock, top 40. I kind of think of 107.1 as one I'm throwing out there on that one. Country still is the most popular format in the nation, and I've had students miss this on the test a zillion times, that it is surprisingly the leader in terms of format and music selection. Urban Contemporary targets a wide variety of African-American listeners, primarily in large cities. We have Spanish language formats, classic rock, and oldies, like 103.5 is the oldies in Cincinnati area. So here's the most popular radio formats in the United States from age 12 and older. So you can see country still leads it at 13%, adult contemporary 8%, news talk 10%, contemporary hit radio 7%, classic rock's only around 6%, classic hits, urban contemporary. So it kind of goes down through the pie there in terms of the percentage. But I don't know, I still listen to sort of the alternative one would be the one for me, and there's only 2% in that category. But you can really tell the difference in terms of when you scan the dial and you're trying to figure out which one's which and how it fits in what category. So nonprofit radio and NPR, the earlier years of nonprofit radio in 1948, the government began authorizing non-commercial license and approved 10-watt FM stations. The Pacifica Foundation formed to run experimental public stations, challenging sort of the regular radio that we had. It was started by a radio reporter and pacifist Louis Kimball Hill during World War II. The first non-commercial networks was the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967. It brought about NPR and the PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service, or alternatives to commercial broadcasting. And again, I have listened in years to NPR, usually on WGUC or some of the other stations that usually affiliated with the university. Miami used to be with WMUB, but they got rid of our station here a few years back, and it's now part of the Dayton, both the television and the radio. I think it's part of the Dayton Consortium of National Public Radio. So the other technologies that offer more stations, satellite radio, again, subscription-based national service through a series of satellite supposed to cover the continental United States. We have XM and Sirius, so they merged to become Sirius XM in 2008. You can access it through satellite radios, mobile devices, cars with the satellite band. I have never done anything in terms of subscribing to those. A lot of new cars, you come with like a free subscription for a while, but to me, I'd rather do the Apple Music, I think, in my opinion. HD radio, digital technology that enables multicasting by AM and FM broadcasters, provides data, program data. So it also gives you an idea of what you're playing too. If you look at the HD radio, it'll give you the descriptions, which they didn't have back in my day. And it's public availability since 2004, and it has multicast up to 3 additional signals. So HD radio is also sort of a newer wave in terms of what you can do with it. Internet radio streaming is a simulcast version of on-air signal over the web or radio stations that they specifically created for the internet. So broadcast radio stations have an online presence like iHeartRadio. And again, the online radio stations that we know everybody wants, Pandora, some of those, 8-Track, Slacker, all these are Spotify, some of the other ones that you can listen to. And again, that's happening too with the convergence in terms of how we're getting our music or how we're getting radio too. And podcasting is the practice of making the audio files available on the internet to download. So it's portable listening. You can listen to radio style programs on a computer or your phone in the car if you want to, portable music, however you want to do it. And the other thing that really goes about with advertising on radio is a lot of people don't realize, again, it's local and national, but it still comprises about 10% of media advertising. The industry revenues drop, but still a number of stations keep getting bigger, and only 20% of their budget goes toward programming. So the national networks provide programming exchange for time slots for national ads too. So they're still making money. I mean, it's despite the fact that some of the radio has gone down in terms of the revenue, they're still viable. There's no question. So the other thing that used to happen, and again, this was more so in the 50s, was the payola. Record promoters paid DJs to play a particular record, so their artists would go up, they'd make more money. And again, there were scandals related to this, the payola system. Alan Freed and some of the other ones were the ones that were really involved in the early 50s in terms of what happened with that. And finally, in 2007, 4 of the largest broadcasting companies agreed to pay $12.5 million to settle a payola investigation by the FCC. So it's still been going on, despite the fact that it was more rampant in the 50s. So sort of the pay-to-play type of thing still gets an effect that whatever artist gets on there, although this has changed with iTunes and Apple Music and streaming music. There's no question it's much different now than it was. So the radio ownership sort of goes from diversity to consolidation. The Telecommunications Act of 1996, which was a big one. There were a lot of problems related to that, but it eliminated most of the ownership restrictions in radio. Again, together, iHeartMedia, Cumulus, and Townsquare Media, they own 1,700 stations, more than 11% of all the stations. They dominate the 50 largest markets, and they control about 1/3 of the radio industry's 7.6 billion revenue. And it also changed. This is how Fox News and some of the other things came about because of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. So it really wasn't there were problems still related to it. So Alternative Voices, the 1990s, the activists set up pirate radio station to protest the large corporations always having control over it. These low power LPFM class of 100-watt stations are trying to be developed. I know some cities down in Cincinnati, we have Urban Artifact has like a 10-watt station in Northside. We used to have a 10-watt station here with Hamilton High, and all these non-commercial stations were approved in 2000 to give voices to local groups that didn't have access. But some of them went by the wayside. Unfortunately, our high school radio went down the hill. They did not continue. But we're seeing sort of a new effort by cities to try to do this in terms of low power radio, particularly more so in some of the bigger cities. So the Prometheus Radio Project, it educates about low power radio so that we can actually sort of pursue it. And one of the things I have to think about in terms of even sort of a debate or essay type question is, is radio essential to democracy, and should we have airways being free and not necessarily controlled? And the influence of radio in terms of our culture can't really be overestimated because it really has controlled culture to a certain extent. And even the early radio debates, political debates for requirement to operate in the public interest or convenience or necessity, that's something that's changed with that Radio Act of 1996 too, that we need to sort of get into a debate about. And there's the trend of radio moving away from being local stations like we had WMOH here locally and PFB in Middletown, that it's more of a national news and rather than the local news or local connection type of thing. So that's the other thing that's really changed. All right, well, that's chapter 5, and I think we'll stop on that one and we'll see how it turns out.